Tangier was a possession of King Charles II between 1661 and 1684. Charles acquired the city as part of the dowry when he married Catherine of Braganza. The marriage treaty was an extensive renewal of the alliance between England and Portugal, opposed by Spain but clandestinely supported by France. England garrisoned and fortified the city against hostile Moroccan forces. When, later, Morocco was united under the Alawites, the cost of maintaining the garrison against Moroccan attack greatly increased, and parliamentary refusal to provide funds for its upkeep forced Charles to give up possession. In 1684 the English blew up the defences and evacuated the city, which subsequently became part of Morocco. History. Background. Morocco. Tangier commands the entry into the Mediterranean and was the principal commercial centre on the northwest coast of Africa. The Portuguese started the colonial empire by taking nearby Ceuta in 1415, and they occupied Tangier in 1471. Years of conflict between Portugal and the Moroccans under the Wattasid and Saudi dynasties followed. However, in 1659, the position changed. Rule of Morocco by the Saudi dynasty finally came to an end with the death of Ahmad al-Abbas and the Alawid conquest of Marrakesh. After the Dilla interlude, the Alawid dynasty came to the forefront. Mullah al-Rashid took Fez in 1666, and Marrakesh in 1669, essentially unifying all of Morocco, except the ports occupied by Portugal, Spain, and England. Before then, in about 1657, Ahmad al-Qadir ibn Ali Ghailan and his family had taken control of much of the Gharb, the Rif and the coastal areas around Tangier. At about that time, Ghailan appears to have considerably increased attacks on the Tangier garrison, but, at the same time, Ghailan was under pressure from the Alawites. Portugal. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in November 1659 specifically pledged Louis XIV to withdraw support from Portugal under the Braganzas, and released Spanish troops and ships to pursue the continuing Portuguese Restoration War. Portugal, severely weakened and with little support in other countries, sought a renewal of the alliance with England to counterbalance the renewed Spanish threat to its independence. The alliance had been adjusted and renewed in 1654 and was again renewed in 1660 after the English Restoration. Negotiations for the marriage of Charles to Catherine of Braganza had started shortly on or perhaps before the Restoration, and the proposed marriage was mentioned by the Venetian envoy to London as early as June 1660. As part of the dowry, Portugal was to hand over the port of Tangier and the island of Bombay, Mumbai, but it is unclear when those detailed terms were agreed and publicly known. Some were widely rumored early, certainly before the marriage treaty itself. Portugal had been in possession of Tangier since 1471, but the Portuguese government was content to part with it, albeit many had reservations. The anchorage was expensive to maintain, not particularly safe for shipping, exposed to the Atlantic and to the destructive Levanta winds, and so required significant improvement. Portugal, hard-pressed in its war of independence with Spain, and struggling against Dutch aggression in the East Indies, could not hope to maintain all of its overseas possessions without English assistance and could not afford to commit troops to the defense of Tangier while fighting Spain in the Iberian Peninsula. Indeed, Portugal had offered Tangier to France in 1648 in soliciting support against Spain. However, cession of Tangier to England was not popular, and the governor of Tangier, Fernando de Meneses, refused to take part. He was replaced in 1661 by the more compliant Luis de Almeida. Spain had tolerated Portuguese occupation of Tangier as part of the Treaty of Tordesillas and had left it undisturbed under Portuguese administration during the Iberian Union and the long-running running Restoration War, but Spain was strongly opposed to English possession of Tangier and insisted that the cession would be illegal. Indeed, the paper presented by the Spanish ambassador in May 1661 openly threatened war. Apart from the threat which an English naval presence at the Straits of Gibraltar would pose to Spain's Atlantic trade, the English fleet activities in the Mediterranean under Robert Blake and Edward Montagu between 1650 and 1659 had shown the vulnerability of the maritime links between Spain and its Italian possessions, Sicily and Naples. With its emphasis on its transatlantic possessions, Spain had no Mediterranean fleet, could not protect its shipping there, and a hostile naval force at Tangier would make the transfer of Spanish troops from Italy to Spain for intended war against Portugal rather more difficult. By proclamation of 7 September 1660, Charles had declared peace with Spain, but in the same month, the Commons passed a bill annexing Dunkirk and Jamaica. There was a fear in England that the Portuguese commander at Tangier would hand the port over to Spain rather than heretic England, or that Spain would otherwise attempt physically to prevent the handover, even if that fell short of war. Dutch Republic. The Dutch, in intense trade competition with England, had no wish to see the English navy further establish the Mediterranean power it had developed under Cromwell, and so also opposed English occupation of Tangier. Any alliance between Portugal and England was an undesirable prospect. The Dutch hoped to seize further Portuguese overseas possessions and, in 1660, equipped a fleet for the purpose. The Dutch tried, unsuccessfully, to strengthen relations with King Charles by the Dutch gift in July 1660. The States General also sought, in negotiations from July 1660 until September 1662, a treaty, a pact of friendship with England, but refused to extend such a treaty to any colonies outside Europe except specifically the island of Pulo Run. While the negotiation of that Anglo-Dutch treaty went on, Charles offered to mediate between the United Provinces and Portugal. That intervention resulted in the Treaty of The Hague of 6 August 1661, ignored by the VOC, which seized Cranganore, Kochi, Nagapattinam and Cananore from Portugal in 1662 to 1663. King Charles sought the advancement of his nephew, later William III, as stadtholder. Johann de Witt, the Grand Pensionary, was a confirmed Republican, and had excluded William III through the secret act of seclusion annexed to the Treaty of Westminster. The States General were unable or unwilling to rein in the VOC's aggressively anti-English and particularly anti-Portuguese activities. Hence the Dutch Republic had no significant influence in Restoration England, and de Witt's diplomatic failures in 1660 to 1661 marked the beginning of the end of the Dutch Golden Age. France. In France, Cardinal Mazarin was at the height of his powers following the formation of the League of the Rhine in 1658, the defeat of the Prince of Condé in Spain at the Battle of the Dunes the same year, and the signing of the Treaty of the Pyrenees on 7 November 1659. Spain and France made peace, and Louis XIV was betrothed to Maria Theresa of Spain. The treaty also required France to cease direct or indirect support for Portugal. 6 months after the treaty was signed, in May 1660, Charles II was restored. A Spain allied to England under King Charles was potentially more powerful than Mazarin sought, and after the Restoration he very quickly restored relations with England. By August, the marriage of Philippe, Duke of Orleans, to Henrietta, sister of King Charles II, was proposed. It is likely that he encouraged the Braganza marriage, but he died on 9 March 1661, and Louis took personal control of government. In July 1661, Louis sent the Comte d'Estrades as ambassador to London, and it is clear from the instructions and correspondence between them that the treaty between England and Portugal was welcomed by France. At the time, France had no significant Mediterranean or East Indies naval presence, and English possession of Tangier and Bombay posed no threat. In 1656, Louis had proposed cession of Tangier to France, but no agreement had been reached, and the peace with Spain probably precluded any further similar proposal. England. In 1659, Cromwell's England was allied to France by the Treaty of Paris, was allied to Portugal, was at war with Spain, and was not a party to the Treaty of the Pyrenees. Charles was, technically, allied to Spain and so pledged to resist Portugal's independence and to raise forces against France by the Treaty of Brussels. The converse of the Commonwealth position. Charles declared peace with Spain in September 1660, but there was already speculation about a possible Portuguese marriage. There is debate as to who proposed Charles's marriage to Catherine of Braganza, and when, but by a letter dated 15 June 1660, the Queen Regent of Portugal, Luisa de Guzman, requested Charles's consent to send Francisco de Mello as ambassador extraordinary to negotiate a new treaty. According to Clarendon's account, the ambassador suggested the treaty and marriage to the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Manchester, who informed the King. Charles consulted Clarendon, Southampton, Ormond, Lord Manchester, and Sir Edward Nicholas, and inquired as to Tangier of Admirals Lord Sandwich and Sir John Lawson. But Clarendon is vague, perhaps misleading, as to chronology. The ambassador, de Mello, had a private audience with Charles on 28 July 1660 and returned to Lisbon on 28 October 1660. The Queen Regent was pleased, and made him Marquis de Sante. He returned to England on 9 February 1661, and from then until announcement of the marriage at the opening of the Cavalier Parliament on 18 May 1661, there were rumours and counter-rumours. Amongst them suggested marriages to Mademoiselle d'Orléans, to an unidentified Princess of Parma, and to Princess Maria of Nassau. Indeed, rumours continued even after that, but the treaty was signed on 23 June 1661, witnessed by Clarendon, Southampton, Albemarle, Ormond, Manchester, Nicholas, and Morris. English take possession. Before the treaty with Portugal was announced, Admiral Sir Edward Montague, 1st Earl of Sandwich, was commissioned to bring Catherine over to England. In July 1660, Montague had secured the position of Clerk of the Acts at the Navy Board for his kinsman and protégé, Samuel Pepys. In February 1661, Pepys speculates on two great secrets: who the king would marry, and the destination of the fleet then being fitted out. On the 20th of April, Pepys was told that the destination was Algiers, and on the 10th of June that Sandwich was to proceed to Algiers to settle the business, go back to Lisbon and collect Catherine in 3 ships, meeting another fleet there. He also carried instructions to seek peaceful arrangements with Tripoli, Techluin, and Salé. The corsair fleet of Algiers was a growing problem and a business which was to be settled by negotiation or by bombardment. Was a treaty not to molest English ships. Sandwich left London on the 13th of June for the fleet assembled at the Downs, and from the sail to Malaga, where he anchored on July 4. Briefly delayed by illness, he arrived off Algiers on July 29. There was little negotiation, and a short bombardment, but weather prevented more significant action. Sandwich left Lawson to blockade Algiers, and proceeded to Lisbon, not yet in his official capacity as an ambassador extraordinaire, but rather to meet a second English fleet which was to meet him. There was a perceived danger that the Spanish and Dutch would attack the Portuguese Brazil fleet, and reciprocally, Spain and the allied Dutch merchants feared that the English would attack the Spanish treasure fleet, hence there was some careful watching until those both arrived safely. The marriage by proxy. If Charles and Catherine was notified to the governor of Tangier by letter from the King of Portugal on the 4th of September 1661. Lord Sandwich sailed to Tangier on the 3rd of October, taking transports for the evacuation of the Portuguese Tangier garrison. He was there for some 3 months, while awaiting the further fleet from England, which was bringing the new governor and troops. Still expecting trouble from Spain of the Netherlands, Lawson's squadron joined him there, unsuccessful in subduing Algiers. During the waiting time, there was correspondence with the other Barbary ports, and with Guilan, who ostensibly welcomed Sandwich. It is likely that Sandwich also used the time to obtain details of the city and its defences. Martin Beckman was with Sandwich's fleet at Algiers and Tangier and probably produced the map later seen by Pepys. On the 6th of September 1661, King Charles appointed Henry Mordaunt, 2nd Earl of Peterborough, as governor and captain-general of all the forces in Tangier. When Peterborough landed, he found the town derelict and under constant attack from some 17,000 Berbers. The Tangier Regiment arrived in Tangier on the 29th of January 1662, together with a former parliamentarian regiment from the garrison of Dunkirk and with remnants of 2 regiments from the disbanded Royalist Irish forces which had been serving in Flanders. They officially took over Tangier from Montague's small naval garrison. The 3 additional regiments were also placed under Peterborough's command. Thus he arrived in Tangier with a force of 500 horse and 2,000 foot, with between 200 and 300 soldiers' wives, to serve in a domestic capacity. This was the first time that wives had officially accompanied an English army on an overseas posting. These units were augmented later in 1661 by elements of Rutherford's regiment and Roger Alsop's regiment just before Peterborough was replaced by Andrew Rutherford, 1st Earl of Teviot, as governor. The regiments were merged, ultimately becoming a single regiment, and the Tangier Regiment remained in Tangier thereafter, a total of 23 years, until the port was finally evacuated in 1684. The English planned to improve the harbour by building a mole, which would reach 1,436 feet long and cost £340,000 before its demolition. The improved harbour was to be 600 yards long, 30 feet deep at low tide, and capable of keeping out the roughest of seas. Work began on the fortified harbour at the end of November 1662, and work on the mole in August 1663. Each redoubt had 400 men guarding the excavation site, while to the front balls of spikes, stakes and piles of gunpowder and stone mix, which acted as basic land mines, were laid. The work continued for some years under a succession of governors. With an improved harbour, the town would have played the same role that Gibraltar later played in British naval strategy. Tangier declared a free city. On the 4th of June 1668, Tangier was declared a free city by charter, with a mayor and corporation to govern it instead of the army. The charter made it equal to English towns. In 1674, William O'Brien, 2nd Earl of Inchiquin, took up the post of governor in succession to the Earl of Middleton. In 1675, a garrison school was founded, led by the Rev. Dr. George Mercer. On the 30th of December 1676, Charles ordered a survey of the city and garrison of Tangier, which was costing about £140,000 a year to maintain. The survey showed that the total inhabitants numbered 2,225, of whom 50 were army officers, 1,231 other ranks, with 302 army wives and children. Amongst the buildings was a hospital and an army school. In 1680, the pressure from the Moroccans increased, as the Moroccan Sultan Moulay Ismail joined forces with the chief of Fez in order to pursue a war against all foreign troops in his land. Reinforcements were needed at the garrison, which was raised to 3,000 in number. The Royal Scots, shortly followed by a further foot regiment, the 2nd Tangier Regiment, raised on 13 July 1680, were sent to Tangier, reinforced the King's Battalion and the remnant of the old Tangier Regiment. The Guards Battalion had landed in July 1680, and fierce attacks were made against the Moors, who had gained a footing on the edge of the town, finally defeating them by controlled and well-aimed musket fire. The battalion remained in Tangier until the fort was abandoned. Also in 1680 the Earl of Inchiquin resigned and was replaced by Thomas Butler, 6th Earl of Ossory, who died before taking up his post. Growing concerns about the cost of the colony. For some time Parliament had been concerned about the cost of maintaining the Tangier garrison. By 1680 the king had threatened to give up Tangier unless the supplies were voted for its sea defences, intended to provide a safe harbour for shipping. The fundamental problem was that in order to keep the town and harbour free from cannon fire, the perimeter of the defended area had to be vastly increased. A number of outworks were built, but the siege of 1680 showed that the Moroccans were capable of isolating and capturing these outworks by entrenchments and mining. The garrison at Tangier had to be constantly reinforced, having cost nearly £2 million of royal treasure, and many lives had been sacrificed in its defence. Merchant ships continued to be harassed by Barbary pirates, and undefended crews were regularly captured into slavery. The so-called Popish plot in England had intensified the dread of Catholicism, and the king's frequent request for more troops to increase the size of the garrison raised suspicions that a standing army was being retained in Tangier to ensure a Catholic succession and absolute monarchy. In October 1680, Colonel Charles Fitzcharles, 1st Earl of Plymouth, arrived as governor, but was taken mortally ill soon afterwards. Lt. Colonel Edward Sackville of the Coldstream Guards took over the governorship temporarily until on 28 December 1680 Colonel Percy Kirk was appointed colonel and governor. In England, in the exclusion crisis, the House of Commons of England petitioned the king to give his assent to the Bill of Exclusion intended to disinherit the Duke of York. The Earl of Shaftesbury urged Parliament to disapprove any taxes unless and until the bill was passed. The king refused to prejudice his brother's right of succession and dismissed the Exclusion Bill. Parliament and, later, the Oxford Parliament. But he could no longer afford the cost of the colony in Tangier. Evacuation of Tangier. Although the attempt by Sultan Moulay Ismail of Morocco to seize the town had been unsuccessful, a crippling blockade by the Jaysh al-Rifa'i ultimately forced the English to withdraw. In 1683, Charles gave Admiral Lord Dartmouth secret orders to abandon Tangier. Dartmouth was to level the fortifications, destroy the harbour, and evacuate the troops. In August 1683, Dartmouth, as Admiral of the Fleet and Governor and Captain-General in Tangier, sailed from Plymouth. He was accompanied by Samuel Pepys, who wrote an account of the evacuation. Once in Tangier, one of Lord Dartmouth's main concerns was the evacuation of sick soldiers, and the many families and their effects to be brought off. The hospital ship Unity sailed for England on 18 October 1683 with 114 invalid soldiers and 104 women and children, alongside HMS Diamond. HMS Diamond arrived at the Downs on 14 December 1683. Dartmouth was also able to purchase the release of many English prisoners from Ismail's Bagnio, including several officers and about 40 men, some of whom had spent 10 years in the hands of the Moroccans. All the forts and walls were mined for last-minute destruction. On 5 February 1684 Tangier was officially evacuated, leaving the town in ruins. Thereafter Kirk's regiment returned to England. The main force of 2,830 officers and men and 361 wives and children finally completed the demolition of the harbour wall and fortifications, and evacuated the garrison during the early months of 1684. The 2nd Tangier Regiment left late in the second week of February for Plymouth with some 600 men and 30 wives and children. The Earl of Dumbarton's regiment went into quarters at Rochester, and Trelawney's regiment to Portsmouth. Some of the departing soldiers were to be rewarded with large land grants in the newly acquired province of New York. Thomas Dongan, 2nd Earl of Limerick, a lieutenant governor of Tangier, became New York provincial governor, and William Tangier Smith, the last mayor of Tangier, obtained 50 miles of Atlantic Ocean front property on Long Island. Governors. Bibliography. Corbett J.S. England in the Mediterranean. E. Chappell ed. The Tangier Papers of Samuel Pepys. John Childs, The Army of Charles II. Martin Malcolm ELBL, Portuguese Tangier, Colonial Urban Fabric as Cross-Cultural Skeleton, Chapter 8. Another. Sir James Halkett, Tangier 1680. The Diary of Sir James Halkett, in Journal of the Society for Army Historical Research. W.F. Lord, The Lost Possessions of England. E.M.G. Ruth, Tangier, England's Lost Atlantic Outpost, 1661–1684. A.J. Smithers, The Tangier Campaign, The Birth of the British Army. Clifford Walton, A History of the British Standing Army, 1660–1700. Public Records Office ADM 106 294. Roger Alsop 1673. ADM 106 314. ADM 1218. ADM 1228 B. British Library Manuscript Collection, 1671–1675. Samuel Luke, Merchant, Tangier, Morocco. Reference Sloane MSS. B. Museum ad. MSS 36528. Diary of John Luke.